Okay. So, welcome everyone. Today we have a very special guest, Sean Carroll, and thank you so much for coming here. He's written a brilliant book, The Serengeti Rules, and this is his fifth book. And I was just asking him, you've already written four, why the fifth book? And we were just joking around, and he said, this is an important story that needs to be told. And there are things that we've learned at the molecular level, things that we've learned at the ecological level. But there are sharp contrasts, and it's a story of those contrasts that he wants to highlight through this book. So without giving much about the book away, without any further ado, actually, let me just welcome him to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sean B. Carroll.
Thanks. Very cool to be here. First visit to Google. I have that creepy feeling that you know a lot more about me than you're admitting. Oh, great, yeah, in case we have to get there. So, and thanks for spending your lunch hour with me. I'm going to try to tell you a couple of stories, and if I guess my major hope is that you'll come out of here with a little bit different view of life, and maybe just a little more hope and optimism about our ability to do some things on this planet to put her back in better shape. So my tales today are going to largely take place on the Serengeti, but before I go there, I want to give you some context. In the summer of 2014, I just finished work on a film for the Smithsonian Channel called Mass Extinction. And in the course of that film, I worked with a couple of ecologists, sort of examining where we were at this time in the world's history. And I learned by going to places like Yellowstone that even some of our most protected places were having certain issues. And like you, I saw headlines like these in newspapers about what was going on with wildlife across the globe, and even stories like this about the plan to build a road through the middle of the Serengeti, a paved road through the middle of the Serengeti. And really it was just my own personal concern, and that maybe these places weren't going to be around or not going to be in the same condition, in a decade or two from now, that I took my family for the first time to the Serengeti in 2014. And there we are at the rather simply marked entrance gate. You sort of expect the famous Serengeti, that there's going to be bells and whistles, and food trucks, right there. Not at all. And in fact, this is the view going through the gate. And as you can see, it's a gravel road. And it was late June, but the grass was kind of brown and fairly high. And as we started driving in, I started getting kind of worried. I'm the only biologist in my clan, and they weren't seeing anything for a little while. It's like, God, this is the Serengeti. Now we did see, after a little while, there's a lioness in the tall grass. I thought, wow, this is really going to be hard. You can't get out of a vehicle because of the danger, so there's 6 of us in a vehicle for days. And if this is what we're going to see, I'm going to be thrown out of the vehicle, I think is what's going to happen. But as we drove on that same day, started to see little streaks of green, little bits of water, a few acacia trees, and then came over a rise and around a bend, and this is what it looked like with a GoPro hanging out of our vehicle. 360 degrees around us, virtually all I could see were zebras. There was a big water hole there that they were drinking at. I would say probably a couple thousand animals in our field of view, and then up from on the horizon, a big troop of elephants walking down. This is home footage. I know this is a terrible thing to do to your friends, which is vacation movies, but these are all shot by my family. So from that point on, the Serengeti offered just an unending canvas of animals of all shapes, sizes, and colors, from sturdy little warthogs to lounging hippos and sleek impala and giraffes. What can I say? I never got tired of looking at giraffes. I don't know what it was. There's probably 20,000 in the Serengeti. I don't think I saw all of them, but I saw a lot. I don't think I have to tell you what this is. She shared about half a day with us, going up and down out of her tree, eating a gazelle. And as I just looked across this incredible landscape, sort of a little uneasy feeling crept across me, because I'm a professional biologist. But I realized I didn't understand what I was looking at. I've worked indoors all my life at a different scale. And I know a few things about how biology works. I knew a few things about how life works, but again, generally at the cellular and molecular scale. And as I got asked questions by family members, it started to get really sort of embarrassing because, Dad, why, ... and I couldn't answer. I've studied the making of the animal kingdom for 30 years. I've worked on the genes that build bodies and create stripes on animals and spots on butterflies and things like this. So I know a lot about that sort of invisible scale of the world, but not anything really about the larger scale. Not until I left the Serengeti and thought I really need to understand how this works. And I think especially here at Google, the theme today would be the numbers. What I was not prepared for. I was awestruck by the Serengeti, but look, I'd watched these films, as a kid and as an adult. I'd read books, etc. But I was not prepared for the numbers of animals that were on the Serengeti. And I didn't understand why, for example, there were so many wildebeest and so few topi, which is about the same sized creature. Now, what I do know is that in biology, at certainly the molecular scale, within animal bodies and within our bodies, everything is regulated. And what I mean by that is there's more than 20,000 substances inside your body, and the amount of each of those substances is regulated. Some things are very, very abundant. Some things are very, very scarce. So whether it's a salt or a fat or a hormone or an enzyme, all those things are maintained in a fairly narrow range by processes within the body. And the same thing is true of the cell types in your body: white cells, red cells, kidney cells, liver cells, etc. There's a particular range of cell numbers, and those are maintained as well. So everything is regulated. And this understanding, for example, of how these things are regulated has led to a revolution in medicine. So the strategy for how this has gone on for the last 50 or 60 years in molecular biology, the study of life at the molecular level, has been really to figure out the rules of regulation in the body. And that's involved, to sort of use a sports analogy, identifying the key players, which are the key molecules that regulate a process, to understand how they interact with other things in the body, or control the amounts of other things, what governs their play. And as I said, this has led to a revolution because once you know those players and the rules of regulation, then we can intervene. And that's what medicine has been doing. And so to give you a couple of examples, what medicine can do, for example, is restore a missing player, something like insulin in the case of diabetes, or in the case of cholesterol regulation, if there's abnormally high levels of cholesterol, to intervene in the regulation of cholesterol synthesis, and that's what Lipitor and other statins do, which has transformed cardiac medicine. So what I want to do today, though, is ask the question, are there rules, just like the rules that operate within our bodies, are there rules that operate on a larger scale? And that's really the main theme of the book, is understanding these rules of regulation. And of course, if there weren't rules that operate on larger scales, the talk would be over and we'd be quickly to the lunchroom. But yes, there are rules. I've called these the Serengeti Rules, but I want you to keep in mind is that these rules operate all over the globe. You can see them in operation there, and I'm going to use sort of these storybook animals of the Serengeti to bring them to life for you. And then in the last little part of my talk, I want to talk about how we can use these rules to preserve or even cure some of the ailing ecosystems around the world, and hopefully give you some concrete examples of how this knowledge is power. I want to start with a little history of the Serengeti that I think you might find interesting. The Serengeti went through various stages of protection in the 20th century, not really becoming a full-fledged national park until the 1950s. And really tourism was insignificant until well after World War II. It's not the sort of thing that people were into, so not much was known about the place. And when biologists showed up, they did sort of the obvious thing, which is they looked around and they said, how many animals are actually here? And the first biologists to do that were a father and son team from Germany named Bernard and Michael Jimmick. And this is a clip from a documentary film they made in 1959 that will show you how they counted all the animals in the Serengeti. And that's Bernard on the left and Michael on the right with their very handsomely decorated plane. And what they did is with two other spotters, they would fly with open doors across the Serengeti, fly low and slow. And this, in the days before digital technology, It's how, well, this is also the animation circa 1959. There you go, prior to George Lucas. And here we're going to get a view of, here they are flying. Okay, that's a lot of animals to be counting, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, but that's what they're doing, flying back and forth in a grid. And you're seeing largely wildebeest on the run here, but they're counting all the large mammals that they can see from the air, big enough to be able to be seen from the air. And they did this for a few weeks' time in January of 1958. And we'll see a shot out of the back of the plane here in a second. All right, so what did they actually count? And they counted 99,481 wildebeest. Not 482 and not 480. Okay, this is done with Teutonic precision. Okay, 57,000 zebra or so, 5,000 topi, 1,800 buffalo, only 60 elephants. Because of the ivory trade in the 19th and early 20th centuries, elephants were still pretty scarce in the Serengeti. 366,000 large animals in all. Now, they were very impressed with this number, and they were very impressed with their technique. They felt that they missed no more than 10,000 animals out of that figure. But in a book they wrote, also called Serengeti Shall Not Die, they expressed their concern. They thought, you know, was there really enough plains and mountains and river valleys and bush areas to maintain the last giant herds still in existence? An answer to their question would soon materialize, but it wasn't the answer that they expected or probably most feared. By the mid-1960s, within a few years, there were changes taking place in the Serengeti. When this young undergraduate from Oxford arrived, Tony Sinclair, first came to the Serengeti in 1965. His intention was to study birds, but he was assigned to one of the first aerial surveys to follow up on what the Jimmics had done in 1958. And in the course of that survey, it was realized that something was going on with the buffalo. That whereas in 1961, about 16,000 buffalo had been counted, there were now 37,000 in 1965. That's a pretty big jump in just 4 years. And so they asked Tony, who wanted to come back and do his PhD in the Serengeti, he said, you know, would you be happy studying buffaloes instead of birds? And he said, yeah, love to. So Sinclair came back, and over a span of about a dozen years, he did sort of his first phase of work that asked a few general questions. And this is, Tony, this is, I believe, a sedated buffalo, because he's not like a buffalo whisperer where, you know, that's not a safe situation unless that buffalo's knocked down. You know, why were the buffalo increasing? What explained the great differences in the numbers of different kinds of animals on the Serengeti? And really, the fundamental thing he wanted to understand was, why is the Serengeti the way it is? So he starts probing this buffalo mystery. He continues to take place in what essentially became annual surveys of the Serengeti animals. And it's true that the buffalo population was growing. In fact, it kept growing into the almost nearly 60,000 by 1972. And so this was a mystery. Why were the buffalo just booming like this? And so Tony started to do some detective work. And you could think up the same sort of hypotheses he did. Why would you have more animals of some type on the Serengeti? Well, one first possibility would be more food. Well, didn't seem like it'd be more food because Serengeti is a big place. It seemed like the same amount of grass was growing. It's a vast place. There was no sign that there was more food in these later years than in earlier years. What about perhaps fewer predators? Maybe fewer buffalo were dying because maybe there were fewer predators. Well, turns out, first of all, Tony carefully looked at what buffaloes die from. It turns out they don't die that often from predation. That's not the major cause of mortality. In addition, not only did the Serengeti have fewer predators, but those counts revealed that they actually had more predators. There were more lions in the Serengeti as the years were going by. So he eliminated that. So how else could he explain more buffaloes? If it's not more food and it's not less predation, well, a third candidate would be disease. Wild animals carry a lot of diseases. It was known the buffalo had a fair number of diseases. And one disease particularly seemed like an important possibility to Tony. And it's a disease called rinderpest, or cattle plague. It arrived in East Africa in the late 19th century. It hit cattle, so cattle that are especially being kept by the Maasai. It hit buffalo and wildebeest, so it hit both domestic and wild animals. And it was thought at the time that the wild animals were the reservoir for this nasty virus. The virus could cause massive losses. So you could lose 90-95% of your cattle. So this could be catastrophic for any nomadic tribe. But in the early 1960s, Tony knew that a vaccination program had started in cattle. So that a good vaccine had been developed, and a program came to vaccinate the cattle of all of these tribes in Tanzania, for example. So could this be it? Could the vaccination program be doing something that was allowing the buffalo to resurge? Well, if you're exposed to a virus, whether it's us or buffalo, you'll make antibodies to that virus. So the way to tell whether something's been exposed to a virus is to get a blood sample. And so Tony got lots of blood samples and then age matched them with various buffalo. And his first eureka moment was when he realized that there was no sign of buffalo being infected past 1964, that the rate of infection had plummeted and the virus had disappeared from the buffalo population in the Serengeti by 1964. So certainly, without rinderpest around, that could explain growing buffalo populations. So this was satisfying, but Tony also knew there was one other species that was affected by rinderpest, and that was the wildebeest. So he started paying attention to the wildebeest. Now, he had been involved in annual counts, but now he was really paying close attention. And so what was happening with the wildebeest at this time? Yeah, look at those numbers. So they had reached by 1977 1.4 million wildebeest. So they had grown at least fivefold in about 15 years. This certainly answered the Jimmick's question that, was there enough food and bush and plains to support all these animals? Oh yeah, there was enough for at least 1 million more animals than were there in 1960. So the wildebeest were also booming. So Tony got blood samples from wildebeest and age matched them and found the same pattern with wildebeest as in buffalo. That, in fact, the wildebeest, there was no virus detectable after 1963. So the virus was disappearing from the Serengeti, and the two affected species, buffalo and wildebeest, were booming. This also shattered the notion that the wildlife was the reservoir of the virus, because the vaccination program was only taking place in cattle. So it was by vaccinating domestic cattle was providing this spillover benefit to the wildlife, and the cattle were not infecting buffalo and wildebeest. So these numbers were booming. So what did this tell Tony? Well, it wasn't just wildebeest and buffalo that were booming. There were other changes taking place in the Serengeti that, by being there year after year, a number of biologists noticed and studied. Let me tell you a few more observations, and let's see if we can connect the dots. One is, fire is an annual event in the Serengeti. But as they looked year over year at the amount of the park that was burned, they saw that no matter what region, north, south, the plains, whatever, overall, that there was less area of the park was burned. And those fires were less intense. Okay, so fewer fires, less intense. It was also observed that there were more giraffes. This is just one sector of the park. So giraffes were increasing. And trees. Now, they could tell early on there were a lot more young trees growing up in the 1970s, and by 1980, I'm showing you a picture taken from the same vantage point in the Serengeti over several decades. And what it really shows is the filling in of this landscape, particularly with mature trees that you can see in recent years. But those are mature trees. You could see the saplings growing much earlier. All right, so fewer fires, more giraffes, more trees. How is this all connected? All right, here's what Tony was able to connect. So let's start back with the eradication of that virus. That virus was somehow was suppressing wildebeest and buffalo populations. So when the virus was eradicated, you got more wildebeest. What do wildebeest do? They eat grass. So with more wildebeest, you have less and shorter grass. In fact, they mow the grass down from about 30 centimeters down to about 10 through their grazing. That shorter grass obviously is less fuel for fires, and there's less grass around. Okay, so fewer fires. Well, one major effect of fire is that fire, particularly low to the ground, is going to burn up saplings, and that's going to suppress the growth of new trees. So that could explain why getting more trees. And then these trees, and especially acacia trees, well, they're food for the giraffes. So eliminating this virus from the cattle population set a whole chain of reactions in motion through the wildebeest, through the grasslands, through the fire cycle, to the trees, to the giraffes. So if you ask Tony what makes the Serengeti the way it is, it's a million lawnmowers. It's a million wildebeest chewing grass, that simple, mundane act. Well, of course, here it is during the big migration when they're making a 600-mile circuit around the Serengeti, essentially mowing it down. And when they mow it down, that short grass provides habitat for butterflies and things like that. The trees provide cover for predators. They provide nesting sites for birds. So this action of mowing really sets the landscape for lots of other species. So the wildebeest are central. They're the lifeblood of the Serengeti. Now, I don't think this is what you get from TV. I see a program, certainly on the African plains, it's not even a second before you see a cat chasing an animal and dragging it down, right? So I've not seen that nice half-hour-long shot of just a wildebeest munching grass. It takes a little more patience to get through that. And in fact, I have to admit this. I asked my family to go out and give these talks for pictures that they had taken in the Serengeti. I said, I really need wildebeest because I didn't find a lot in my own camera. Zebras, giraffes, lions, cheetahs, leopards, great birds, ostrich. We took all those pictures. Very few pictures of wildebeest. They're everywhere, so you ignore them, right? And they're kind of homely, right? So they just don't have that sort of charisma. But they are the lifeblood of the Serengeti. So biologists have a name for something that carries out such an important role. And this brings me to my first Serengeti rule. You'll get a few of these today. And that is that some animals are more equal than others, to kind of paraphrase George Orwell. That there's a lot of animals out there, but some have a greater impact on the diversity of the communities they live in. And the name for this is called a keystone species. And this keystone idea came from another zoologist working somewhere else in the world. So this wasn't discovered on the Serengeti. It was just recognized on the Serengeti. And that biologist is named Bob Payne from the University of Washington. And he was studying the intertidal zones along the Pacific coast. And he found that this starfish, this apex predator starfish, was a keystone species in the community along the intertidal. Because much like the keystone in a Roman arch, if you removed it, which he did, the community collapses. Sorry, it's a little frenetic animation there on the right. But the idea is that some species have a really disproportionate effect on community diversity, and we call these keystones. Bob Payne also coined another term to describe this sort of relationship, this sort of cascading effect of one species on others, and a really strong effect, indirect effects on other species. We describe creatures that do sort of different jobs in nature, that occupy sort of different levels of the food chain as different trophic levels. And he describes this as a trophic cascade, where an animal at one level is having effects on both plants and animals at other levels in the system. And that brings me to my second Serengeti rule. These trophic cascades are not at all restricted to the Serengeti. In fact, they were first discovered elsewhere. Sorry. And they were quite a surprise. Not the sort of thing that ecologists expected, that you had creatures that had a very strong effect on something, but it was indirect, not a direct action. So some species have these strong indirect effects through trophic cascades. Now, so I told you a little bit about what's going on in the Serengeti. You might have at least one question might have popped into your mind, which is, all right, so the wildebeest do this lawn mowing. That sort of sets the stage for all the other sorts of animals. They're a keystone. These cascades are operating. What regulates the wildebeest? Did they just keep right on growing past 1.5 million animals? No, because if they kept growing at that rate, essentially Africa would be shoulder to shoulder with wildebeest right now. So no, that's not their fate. What happened was they leveled off. They've leveled off at about 1 million wildebeest. So the 1.4 million was actually the high water mark, and they've since come down. And why did this happen? What regulates the wildebeest? What maintains them at about 1 million animals today? And I want to tell you this because this is a really important general principle about how many animal populations are regulated and very important to conservation. All right, so pay attention to this sort of low end of the curve here. Here in the early years, once the virus is disappearing, they're growing at a maximal rate. Sorry, I'm just going to come right this. I got a happy thumb. They're growing at a maximal rate. So that's virtually up to the maximum that's capable by reproduction. But you can imagine that they could be regulated in one of two major ways. They could be regulated from the bottom up by the amount of food, or really from the top down by the number of predators. So what's going on here? And before I tell you exactly what's going on with the wildebeest, let me tell you what's going on with other animals in the Serengeti. And I'm going to show you a graph that, for me, was one of the most, I guess, educational or informative graphs I encountered in the scientific literature. It really gives me insight of what lifestyles are like, or life is like for animals on the Serengeti. And what this is a plot of the percent of the animals that die by predation against animal body size. So ponder this for a little bit. So animals could be regulated by predation from the top down or by food from the bottom up. And if you look at the smaller animals like the oribi and the impala and the topi, 100% predation. I mean, what do they tell their youngsters, growing up? Someday, Junior, you're going to be eaten alive, right? So that's the life of an oribi. But if you go to the other end of this with elephants and hippopotamus and rhinoceros, you see virtually no predation, no significant mortality due to predation. So the large animals have escaped, essentially, the force of predation. The small animals have not. They essentially fully died by predation. And there's a little bit in between here. So buffalo, maybe about 20% predation. Zebra, a higher fraction. So there's really two lifestyles on display here. Either get big and escape predators. But if you're that big, you're, of course, really heavily dependent upon food because you've got to maintain that big body weight. Or be small, but you're going to have a high reproductive rate. You're going to reproduce very often. And because if you don't, the predators are going to eat you to extinction. In fact, for oribi at that size, it's not just the cats. There's about 10 species that prey on oribi, and that includes snakes and large birds, for example. So they've got a lot of things to worry about at that end. So where's the wildebeest on this scale? Well, it turns out that the wildebeest are largely food regulated. And let me tell you how this works, and it has to do with thinking about these two different ends of the curve. When food per capita, per individual wildebeest, is plentiful, growth is maximal. So down here, this is a low density of animals, and a high growth rate. But once the numbers get larger, the growth rate declines, actually turns negative. The population starts to shrink when food is limiting. And how does this work? It works like a feedback mechanism because according to the density of the animals. As the density of the wildebeest increases, there's less food per individual. So any kind of stress like drought will cause a reduction in the population. But once there's been that reduction in the population, in further seasons, there's more food available per capita, and the population rebounds. And that's what stabilizes the population, this sort of feedback between being limited by food and being able to rebound once food is plentiful, or, in fact, nature culling when food is not so plentiful. And this is really important. This end of the curve is really important for what I'll tell you about what goes on in some other species. Okay, so this leads us to our third Serengeti rule. There's only 27 of these, so I'm sure we're going to make it by 1 o'clock. So the regulation of some species depends upon their density. So just ponder that for a little bit. Now, I told you these 3 rules, and I've illustrated them on the Serengeti, but the main point I want you to take away today is that every place is a Serengeti. And I thought, since I'm out so close here, what do I mean by that? It's a place with most places have keystone species. They have these trophic cascades operating, and they have predators, they have herbivores, and they have producers or plants, green things that are the bottom of the food chain that feed the herbivores that in turn provide for the carnivores. And just to drive this home for where I am, I'll give you an example that a kelp forest, Monterey Bay, is a Serengeti. And it has these 3 levels, and the big fearsome predator in the Monterey system are sea otters. It's actually otters preying on urchins that make it possible for the kelp forest to grow. When otters were nearly exterminated at the end of the last century, kelp forests disappeared across the Pacific, and just these urchin barrens, carpets of sea urchins, were all that existed up and down the Pacific coast, all the way through the Aleutian Islands. Took a while. This was a major discovery by Jim Estes, who's over at the University of California, Santa Cruz, to understand that sea otters are a keystone in that system, and it's the regulation of urchin populations by sea otters that allows the kelp to flourish. The kelp, in turn, provides habitat to all sorts of creatures, much greater biodiversity when kelp forest is present than when it's not there. So everything is a Serengeti, and that's important to keep in mind when we now think about what are we doing, how are we impacting habitats, and what might we be doing differently in order to help habitats be more productive. So it's the same logic, it's the same strategy as medicine, that the health of the ecosystem depends on understanding the key players, the key species that regulate community structure, understand the rules of the game, how they govern the numbers of other creatures, and then we have to consider what can we do to either replace what's missing or fix broken links, or not do things that break links. So let me give you just a couple examples of interventions to sort of put these Serengeti rules to practice. So here's another Serengeti. It's not what you'd think, I imagine. A blade of rice is a Serengeti. I'll show you 2 members of that habitat for a second. This is a plant hopper, pretty small bug that likes to eat and actually suck the fluid out of rice. So this is the system as you can sort of think about it, and you can imagine that when farmers see these plant hoppers, they can get pretty nervous because enough plant hoppers can really damage a crop. And so the practice for managing this pest has been, of course, to apply pesticides. And after the Green Revolution in the 1960s, with improved rice strains, and you know that rice covers a huge part of Asia, these problems started to pop up. And so farmers started using pesticides year in and year out. And when they sprayed their fields with pesticides, they sometimes got a surprising result, which was they saw the plant hoppers go up to 800-fold, and they saw their rice plants be demolished. How does this work? Why would adding a pesticide actually increase the number of insects on your plants? Well, first of all, after years of using the pesticide, the bugs had become resistant. But that only would explain, the bugs would just shrug off the pesticide, pay no attention. Why did they actually increase in numbers? Again, took a little while to figure this out, but the hoppers are exploding, and this is a visual effect of what happens on in the field. The hoppers are exploding because actually the pesticide is taking something out of that little miniature Serengeti. It's killing spiders. And spiders are one of the natural enemies of plant hoppers, not resistant to the pesticide. So that when pesticides applied, the natural enemies are killed off, the plant hoppers have nothing to control them. So pest management practice, particularly in places like Indonesia, had to change radically to not using massive amounts of pesticide, but for example, planting other plants in and around rice fields to give refuge to natural predators, and giving those predators a chance to actually control the bugs themselves. And that's still a practice that's used widely today, recognizing that having natural enemies about is really important, and that pesticides are not, in this case, a panacea for the appearance of these sorts of pests. So spiders are playing the role here that big cats play on the Serengeti. I'll give you another example, maybe a little more familiar, which is Yellowstone National Park. The observation that goes back a ways that's really important is that here's a grove of aspen, a great symbol of the American West. But some botanists realized that there was something strange about the aspen populations in Yellowstone and other parts of the American West, in that most of them were really old. There was very little fresh aspen growth in about the 7 decades from the mid-1920s or 1930s to about the mid-1990s. there's what you'd expect to be whole age classes of aspen that were missing. So why would that be happening? Well, one of the obvious culprits would be the grazers in the park, like the elk, and you can see the effect of elk grazing up to up on the bark of trees. So why would the elk be suppressing the aspen so profoundly? And one suspect would be that there's nothing controlling the elk. If elk are controlling the aspen, what's controlling the elk? Well, we know that wolves were exterminated from Yellowstone in the mid-1920s. So the possibility was that maybe the disappearance of those wolves was having an effect on the age structure of trees and plants in Yellowstone. Well, that was sort of put to the test, deliberately or not, when wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone in 1995. And now I can update you 20 years later on what's been observed now that wolves have been put back. So what could possibly happen here is the wolves could possibly control the number of elk, and that might influence vegetation in aspen, vegetation like aspen inside of Yellowstone. That's exactly what was seen. So here's the wolf populations, which vary a little bit over the years, but elk have been pretty much showing a steady decline as they're consumed by wolves. What goes on with the trees? Well, you see a lot less browsing in the upper right and a lot greater aspen height. But there are still some more surprises than this in store for the biologist. If you look at other sorts of plants, like willows that like to grow along stream edges, this is a picture from the same vantage point before wolves and after wolves. The willows are growing. Well, willow is perfect beaver habitat, so the beavers come into this area. They use the willows to make dams. So whereas there was only one beaver colony in all of Yellowstone prior to wolf reintroduction, there's now up to 12. So willow is rebounding, cottonwood is rebounding. So there's been a major effect not just on elk numbers, which are down in Yellowstone by more than 50% due to the presence of wolves, but a big change in the vegetation. And that vegetation has a big ripple effect on other species in Yellowstone. So just restoring one species, a keystone, this apex predator of the wolf, has had a dramatic effect on Yellowstone. So the message I'd like you to take from that is that in general, and Yellowstone shows this, that nature is resilient. These populations can come bounding back if they're given the chance. Habitat, protection, time. Populations can rebound dramatically. And let me pull a few more, maybe some familiar species out of history for you. Give you these numbers. And you'll know some of these certainly from the California coast. Here's a set of species that had gained protection at different times once their numbers were severely depleted, and here's where they're at today. So look at the northern elephant seal. It was down in the late 1800s to as few as 20 individuals. 200,000 today. Sea otter was down to as few as 1,000 individuals across the entire Pacific. Over 100,000 today. Northern Pacific humpback, same sort of effect, 10-fold increase. Bald eagle since the 1960s, 20-fold increase. Gray wolf, once they're introduced, a lot more wolves now in the whole greater Yellowstone system. So given a chance, nature is quite resilient. Given that protection, given a habitat, animal numbers can come roaring back. Now these are individual species that were granted individual protections. What do we do in the case of a place where the whole habitat has been deeply disturbed? And I want to close today with one story out of a pretty special place in the world. Special because its history looked so dire at one time. And it's in Mozambique in southeastern Africa. Now, Mozambique is a country about double the area of California. It has lots of natural areas, but it's had a really rough history. So after its independence from Portugal in 1975, it went through a civil war. And in the center of Mozambique, really a geographic center, is this park called Gorongosa. And Gorongosa was a gem. In the 1960s, it was a destination for jet setters like John Wayne and all that going on safari. It had big concentrations of wildlife, like 500 lions and 15,000 buffalo and a few thousand elephants, a few thousand hippos, etc. So let me take you back to the early 1960s. I wish I had some of that 1960s music here for you, but just a little clip of, I know these vehicles still roam California, but they don't roam Gorongosa anymore. So you see the lions right out there. And people were going to see these lions. The lions were the symbol of Gorongosa, and there were hundreds of them. But then the Civil War broke out. And unfortunately, Gorongosa was one of the main battlefields. It's where rebels established a stronghold. There were lots of conflicts in Gorongosa. And so many of the large animals were shot either for meat, for poaching, or just as collateral damage to the conflict. So let me show you the numbers of animals before and after the war. So before the war is the blue bars. You can see the buffalo up there around 14,000. We're down here to fewer than 100. Elephants in the thousands, again, small numbers. Hippos decimated, waterbuck decimated, zebra almost cleared out. Lion, there were no detectable lions in the park in the year 2000. So this was, this I think is decimation. But that was the way Gorongosa was after the Civil War, and the way it would probably remain, were it not for an American philanthropist named Greg Carr, who learned about Mozambique, learned about Gorongosa, and in 2004, I wanted to show you what Gorongosa looked like at the time too, and this is the status of the park. All the buildings were shot to pieces, all the vehicles were shot to pieces. But in 2004, Greg Carr came along and signed an agreement, a joint management agreement with the Mozambique government to try to restore Gorongosa National Park. And the goal was really twofold, to restore the park as an economic engine in the area, and to do a lot of human development around the park in the form of clinics, schools, because the infrastructure of Mozambique had really been abandoned, neglected for more than 30 years. So Carr committed to a long-term joint management project with Mozambique. He's now about 12 years into this. I visited Gorongosa last summer, so if you'll forgive me that this is not quite National Geographic quality film, I'll tell you what's going on in Gorongosa now. I'm hanging out of a helicopter with a handheld camera, so give you some sense of what this place is like. So the major feature of Gorongosa is a huge lake at its center called Lake Urema. It fills and floods during the wet season, and then as that water shrinks and all the silt that's been carried down from the mountains is there, it creates this giant salad bowl, which we're kind of tilting over. And you can see some of the dots and some of the animals running are largely waterbuck out feeding on this gigantic salad bowl. And you see these little fingers of waterways through there. There's a pretty good number of crocs in Gorongosa. But it's a very, very different landscape than the Serengeti. Really different relative numbers of all sorts of different kinds of species that used to be there. Now, this is what you can see in 2015. We're going to go out over the water a little bit and give you a little sense of what else is floating about Gorongosa. You might just pick them out there, but here's a nice little group. You guys make out what those are? Hippos, right? You can find them on Google Image. Okay, just to help you out. And it's a pretty big pod of hippos. And we'll spin around a little bit, and then we'll go a little deeper into the forest, and I'll show you a little more of the wildlife that's there. And here you go. So just this group of elephants, you can tell there's a lot of youngsters in here. So a lot of young elephants in Gorongosa today. So how have the large animal populations changed in a dozen years? Well, the baseline was back in 2000 when you combined all the antelope, buffalo, hippos, elephants, etc., fewer than 1,000 large animals combined. In the last survey, 71,000. A little more than a decade. All right, so a radical change, a radical rebound. And what was involved in here was a little bit of importation. Carr brought in a couple hundred buffalo, brought in a few elephants, a few hippo, but largely this is the rebound of the populations that were already there just by being protected from any further exploitation. So the success in Gorongosa has prompted an even bolder vision. It's a big park. It's a vast place with lots and lots of different kinds of habitats. But Mozambique is a vast place, and they'd like to have an even greater protected area. And so the vision for Gorongosa is to expand it. This is the current boundaries of the park shown here. Is to expand it about 8-fold to create a giant conservation area that will be about the size of the Serengeti Conservation Area in Tanzania, an area large enough to hold perhaps 10,000 elephants and about 500 lions. And that endeavor is now underway. As far as the Serengeti itself, I am happy to report that after years of deliberation, the only roads going through the Serengeti, for now, are unpaved. And let's hope they stay that way. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. This was a fantastic talk. Such a positive note. We're open for questions now. Please just point and I'll bring the mic over.
So I suspect that small amounts of hunting don't really impact these kinds of numbers very much, but they do some. But I'm wondering about the trade-off between hunter-paid money to these parks versus hunting, and what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so it's a common practice in Africa that there are hunting concessions as these big lands were carved up. Some of these go back many decades, that certain areas are leased to concessionaires that run hunting operations. That can be an important source of currency for management in those countries. We all know the pretty famous case of Cecil the lion, which was not a good story. But in the vast Gorongosa area, in the map I just showed you, there are in fact a couple hunting concessions. So as long as you know what's being taken and there's some reliable census, you can sort of figure out, well, what amount of take can be managed. In things like water buck, it would take a lot of water. You have to kill a lot of water buck to probably dent the system. When you think of top predators, there's only 63 lions in Gorongosa today. So that's just way too few, relative to history. There are no leopards in Gorongosa in the main park. There are no hyena, really another important predator. So, certainly at the moment, nobody wants to see those animals taken by hunting. So it's just a part of, I think, the practical reality that it's a source of revenue, and revenue really matters in these parts of the world. But by the same token, the deer hunt in Wisconsin, which I think we issue 600,000 permits, for a 9-day season in November, that pays for virtually all the management activities of all the other wildlife in the state. So I think that, again, if you have good scientific management of those game populations, then a certain amount of hunting, may be manageable. In the Serengeti, there's always wildebeest being taken by the native Tanzanians. But as long as that doesn't exceed maybe 20 or 30,000 animals a year, it won't make a dent. They'll actually be replenished. So there's a certain amount of sustainable hunting that's possible.
Except for your first example, which is the biggest one, most of the Keystone species were actually predators.
Yes.
Are there special rules about the non-predator species being keystones, and it seems like it's harder to restore them? It's more like an unusual situation, possibly.
Yeah, I think the non-predators become keystones when they're especially kind of what's called ecosystem engineers. So wildebeest, by mowing, a vast tract of the Serengeti, have a big effect. In the Himalayas, pika are ecosystem engineers, and they affect the pattern of runoff, and they create these burrows that other animals live in. And so you can be a keystone without being a predator. But as it turns out, these predators that have these strong indirect effects downstream of them, only fairly recently we started to appreciate how important that is. In fact, most ecologists thought that the world was really regulated from the bottom up, that plants gathered sunlight and converted it to food, and that the whole system flowed from the bottom up, and that maybe predators were sort of, if there was enough game or enough prey around, that they were sort of like ornaments on the tree, right? Not really imagining that predators were driving the structure of these systems, as starfish do on the coast, or sea otters do, or as other predators do, like spiders do on plants. So we're just, I still think we're still gathering getting our heads around the importance of apex predators in the world. There's still a lot of primary work in the scientific literature sort of calling attention that these apex predators also are generally disproportionately exploited at a much higher rate than other sorts of populations. In the ocean, it's the big apex predators like cod and tuna that we like to eat. And if we overfish those have huge cascading effects down the line in the oceans. So yeah, a lot are apex predators, and I think there's the general mindset is we've got to be a lot more alert to what we're doing to apex predator populations. You know, the history of this, you know, wolves, lions, coyotes, things like this, is we didn't like them around humans, right? So we killed them. And in the ocean today, you know, the predator that's disappearing most rapidly are sharks, from both finning and from bycatch. And you know, there are people who, of course, care a lot about sharks, but they're not the sort of, you know, we don't have the same kind of emotional reaction to sharks that we have to manatees or tigers or leopards or things like that. So we've got to be aware of the role of apex predators. I mean, look, sea otters. This blew ecologists' minds to think that essentially the whole coastal ecosystem depended upon these furry little predators eating those urchins, right? Just turn people's thinking upside down.
Other questions?
I'm wondering, do you generally find that you have one keystone species in an ecosystem, or are there sometimes none or sometimes many?
Sometimes none. So jobs seem to be sort of parceled out more broadly. Sometimes multiple. I think, you know, we're land dwellers, so we first of all, we tend to study terrestrial systems with a certain amount of bias. But out in the ocean, it's kind of hard to decide where all the keystones are, because it's a fish-eat-fish world. You have really vast webs of fish feeding on other sorts of fish. So we know that apex predators are important, but because there are lots of, you know, almost everything in the ocean is a predator, every fish in the ocean is a predator, that you just have really complex webs, and there's no way to sort of clearly pick out and say, well, this is a keystone that's, you know, so in a clean line connected to just two or three other sorts of things. So there's lots of cascades running in the ocean, but not such clearly delineated keystones.
All right. Thank you so much for the fantastic talks.
Well, thanks, Google. Now enjoy your tuna and cod lunch. So, yeah. Thanks.
Will you be staying for like a few minutes to sign any books?